Thank you for joining us for this roundtable discussion on Native Reads, Great Books from Indigenous Communities. My name is Sarah Hernandez, and I'll be moderating this panel this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I am an assistant professor of Native American literature at the University of New Mexico. I'm a Sicangu Lakota, and I'm also a member of the Oak Lake Writers Society, a tribal group established in 1993 by Dakota scholar Elizabeth Cookland and South Dakota professors Charles Woodard and Lowell Amiot to support Oceti Sakowin, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota writers. The goal of the Oak Lake Writers Society is to increase the number of tribal writers publishing and presenting in the Great Plains region. 2 years ago, First Nations Development Institute, a Native grant-making institution, awarded the Society a $10,000 grant to design a direct mail campaign to increase knowledge of and appreciation for Indigenous literatures. The Oak Lake Writers Society worked on this campaign for more than half a year, and we intended to promote it at a number of different conferences and events. We had hoped to visit schools, libraries, and share it with teachers, students, and general readers. The campaign officially launched in March 2020, and then, of course, the pandemic hit. And as we all know, our world changed. Most states started shutting down. Every single conference and event that we had planned for Native Reads was canceled. And as a result, we've never really been able to promote this amazing project in the way that we hoped or the way that we envisioned. And so we're really grateful to the Institute for American Indian Research, IFAIR, for sponsoring this virtual event tonight. In particular, I wanted to thank IFAIR's board, Doctors Jennifer Dennett-Dale, Lloyd Lee, Nick Estes, Melanie Yazzie, and Holly Guys for providing us with this digital platform to discuss and share this important project. I also wanted to thank our graduate assistant, Amaya Lazaro, for helping us organize this online event, and Tashi Berendo for helping us with the technology parts of this event. So over the past 2 years, we've all worked really hard on the Native Reads project, and it's something that we're really proud of. It's a project that we hope will benefit our tribal communities for generations to come. And it's a project that we hope other tribes will adapt and modify for their own communities as well. So to begin, what is Native Reads? Okay. So as I mentioned, Native Reads began as a direct mail campaign to honor and celebrate Oceti Sakowin writers. It's a 12-page educational booklet that provides a brief overview of the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition. Few people, both Native and non-Native, believe that we have our own literary traditions. So to challenge this misguided notion, we identified 10 books that we think are critical and foundational to understanding Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota cultures, language, histories, and politics. So these 10 books include Joseph Marshall's The Lakota Way, Deloria's Water Lily, Charles Eastman's The Soul of an Indian, Joseph Wagner's Witness, Vine Deloria Jr.'s Custer Died for Your Sins, Elizabeth Cookland's Anti-Indianism in Modern America, Lydia Whirlwind Soldier's Memory Songs, Layli Long Soldier's Whereas, and Nick Estes's Our History is the Future. So tonight we're going to discuss all of these books in more detail and explain why we think these authors and texts are so important to the Oceti Sakowin Oate. Before we get started though, I wanted to introduce our panelists this evening. And so this is a picture of the Native Reads Selection Committee. The selection committee is comprised of 6 members of the Oak Lake Writers Society. The Oak Lake Writers Society is a supportive group of 30 Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota writers who either volunteered for this project or were selected to assist with this project because of their expertise and their commitment to preserving and perpetuating Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota cultures and literatures. So the 6 members of the committees include Laniko Lee, Miniconjou Lakota, Gabrielle Tachioskan, Sisseton Wahpeton Dakota, Joel Waters, Oglala Lakota, and Tashi Youngpa Livermont Berendo, Oglala Lakota. The 6th member of our committee is Patty Bordeaux Nelson, Sicangu Lakota. Patty couldn't be here tonight, but she did ask me to convey the following message. And so I do want to read this message because I think it is a really good description of the Native Reads Project. So Patty says, quote, "It is of great importance that the Oceti Sakowin voice tell our history. For many of us, a resource like Native Reads was not available. Constantly, we went through school invisibly, hearing and reading stereotypes of who white writers said we were. Native Reads validates Oceti Sakowin students by having books by their own people at their fingertips." In this brief statement, I feel like Patty really captures the purpose and the motivation of Native Reads. We wanted to create a resource that future generations could use to learn more about their rich and complex literary traditions from a tribal perspective. So tonight I also asked one additional panelist to speak about the importance of the Native Reads Project. That's Mabel Peacock, Yankton Sioux tribe. Mabel is the principal of Teoshpazina Tribal School in Sisseton, South Dakota, and she's agreed to provide insight from her perspective as an educator about the importance of and need for this type of project. And so I want to thank all the panelists for being here tonight and for their important contributions to this project. We're going to chat with the panelists a little bit more later in the evening. But before we begin our roundtable discussion with the panelists, I wanted to give everybody a bit more background on the Native Reads Project. So why is a project like Native Reads even important or necessary in the first place? Well, for more than 200 years, Native American and Indigenous literatures have been shaped and delivered by individuals from outside our tribal communities, beginning with missionaries, explorers, government officials, and more recently, scholars such as anthropologists, historians, and other social scientists who attempted to divide our literary traditions for us. Now, oftentimes these individuals tell us that our literary tradition is an inferior knowledge system that is either extinct or it's rapidly nearing extinction. Due to the devastating effects of settler colonialism, which includes religious indoctrination, boarding schools, language eradication, criminalization, and land theft, few people, both Native and non-Native, actually believe that the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition still exists today. As a result, Oceti Sakowin books are rarely taught in classrooms located on their ancestral homelands in the Northern Great Plains region. And so the purpose of the Native Reads Project is really to dispute that dominant view. And instead, what we're trying to do is we're trying to demonstrate that the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition is still alive and well today. So as part of the Native Reads campaign, what we did is we reconstructed the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition by compiling a list of 200 books by Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota writers. We then narrowed these books down to 10 books that we thought are critical and foundational to understanding the Oceti Sakowin, and we organized them into an educational booklet that can be used to help guide both Native and non-Native readers toward a broader understanding of Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota cultures, histories, literatures, and politics. Now, what's so unique about Native Reads is that this is an entirely community-led project. Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota educators, writers, scholars, all help design and implement this entire project themselves. And so for more than a year, the 6 of us worked together to design and implement the Native Reads Project. In May 2019, we surveyed Oceti Sakowin tribal citizens about their knowledge of and access to Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota literatures. As I mentioned, we compiled a bibliography of 200 books by Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota writers. Then the selection committee narrowed these books down to 10 books that we feel are critical and foundational to understanding the Oceti Sakowin. Now, because I'm kind of a nerd, one of the most interesting things to me about this project was the survey. And so I do want to take a minute to talk about the survey. So in May 2019, we conducted an online survey asking Oceti Sakowin citizens 5 questions about their knowledge of and access to literature by Indigenous writers from their own tribal communities. And so the 5 questions I have here on the slide include: 1, how many books have you read by Dakota, Lakota, or Nakota writers? 2, who suggested these books? Was it a teacher, family member, friend, others? What barriers did you encounter trying to access these books? 4, what are the most important or impactful books written by Dakota, Lakota, Nakota writers? And finally, 5, why did you select these books and what makes them important to our communities? Now, in all likelihood, this survey probably marks the first time that tribal citizens have been asked about their knowledge of and engagement with Oceti Sakowin literatures. We received 40 responses from the online survey from individuals living in both reservation and urban Indian communities. Survey respondents were between 18 and 70 years old. And I think the first and perhaps most troubling thing that we learned from this survey was that 1 in 3 individuals surveyed said that they didn't realize that the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition still exists today. And honestly, this number is probably higher. Many individuals were reluctant to take this survey, and they would often say, well, we've never read a book by a writer from our own tribal community. We don't think we have anything to contribute to this survey. And so it was actually really hard to get folks to respond to the survey because they said they just simply didn't have knowledge. They didn't see any reason in taking this survey. And so I think this number of 1 in 3 is actually probably higher. But what we did learn from this survey is that this survey revealed a striking disparity between generations. People who were under 35 tended to read less books by Oceti Sakowin writers. People over 60 years of age tended to read more books by Oceti Sakowin writers. This disparity, it's likely the result of age and experience. The older you are, the more books you've read, right? But I also think it's important to note that individuals over 60 years old were also young adults during the Native American literary renaissance, which was that period between the 1960s and the 1980s. During that period, a lot of Native authors and poets were popular with the mainstream, and thus their books were more accessible to the reading public. So in other words, when Native American literature was a literary trend, it was being taught in schools. However, when that fad kind of ended, many teachers seemed to stop discussing Native American literature with their students. And so in fact, survey respondents between 30 and 50 years old indicate that none of their teachers ever recommended an Indigenous book to them after the Native American literary renaissance. And I think in a lot of ways that explains, why somebody like myself didn't even read a book by an Indigenous writer until I was 19 or 20 years old. And I think at the time I thought maybe it was something that I did, I had done wrong, that I hadn't been paying enough attention to writers from my own community. After this survey, I think what I've realized was that the issue wasn't necessarily me. It was more likely that the issue was the schools who weren't teaching these books in their classrooms. So clearly younger generations are struggling to learn about and even access books and resources about writers from their own tribal communities. The fact that Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people don't see themselves reflected in their textbooks or in their curriculum, the fact that they don't have regular access to their literatures is unacceptable. This lack of knowledge and awareness, it's starting to have a devastating effect on tribal youth and their communities. For many teachers in the Northern Great Plain regions, they say they don't teach Oceti Sakowin literature in the classroom because, they don't know which books to teach. Again, implying that we don't have a literary tradition of our own, when in fact, what we've learned from this project, right, is that Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota writers have published extensively over the past 2 centuries. And so I think because of a project like Native Reads, educators and administrators can no longer use that excuse that they don't know what books are available by tribal writers from our community, right? We've just compiled a list of 200 books by Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota writers, as well as a number of other educational resources to help teachers and students read and engage with the rich and complex Oceti Sakowin literary tradition. So I think one of my favorite parts of this Native Reads campaign is the story keeping timeline that we developed for the Native Reads project. Like I said, the Native Reads project is a 12-page educational brochure. Within this brochure, we created this story keeping timeline with those 10 books that we think are critical and foundational to understanding the Oceti Sakowin. We organized this timeline from the oral, we organized this timeline from the oral tradition up until present. And what we did, like I said, I love this timeline. I think it's really well done. First Nations did a great job of taking the content and the information that we've written and placing it in this this story keeping timeline. So the story keeping timeline is divided into 5 periods: time immemorial, the pre-colonial period, settler colonialism, sovereignty and self-determination, and the future. And so time immemorial refers to the oral tradition. Since time immemorial, the Oceti Sakowin have relied upon oral stories, histories, songs, and traditions to sustain Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota cultures, languages, and values. These important cultural practices still exist today in both oral and written forms. Oral stories and the printed stories that have emerged from them are unique to each family and to each community. As a result, there are many variations of these oral stories. And although there are a number of Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota writers who have reimagined these oral stories in print form, we ultimately selected Joseph Marshall's book, The Lakota Way, as a book that we thought was representative of the oral tradition. In Marshall's book, he shares 12 cultural and spiritual lessons that he learned from his Sicangu Lakota grandparents. From the oral tradition, we move on to the pre-colonial period. Settler colonizers, like I said, such as fur traders, explorers, missionaries, were beginning to encroach on our traditional homelands at this time, but we hadn't yet moved on to reservations. So this period is discussed best by Ella Deloria in her book Water Lily. Next, we shift into a period that we describe as settler colonialism, the establishment of reservations, boarding schools, and other harsh assimilationist policies that led to the near loss of our culture, language, and literary traditions. At this time, a lot of our oral traditions and literary traditions moved underground. The 2 writers that we thought were best representative of this period were Dakota writer Charles Eastman, who was born and raised during this time period, and Josephine Wagner, who's in her book Witness. Wagner was also a boarding school student who was raised during this time period. And we feel like these 2 books, The Soul of an Indian and Witness, provide significant insight into that devastating transition period. So obviously there are a number of Oceti Sakowin writers who began writing and publishing during and after the boarding school period, but we couldn't include all of them on this list, right? So instead what we wanted to do is we wanted to provide folks with a starting point where they could start to learn about this particular time period and moment in our culture and history. And so the story keeping timeline is 2 pages. On the second page, we start to look at the period after the boarding school era. The boarding school period might have ended, but settler colonialism never stopped, right? However, we did want to acknowledge an important point of renewal in our culture and history. We termed the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s as a period of sovereignty and self-determination. And this moment was really led by Indigenous writers and scholars like Elizabeth Cookland, who founded the Oak Lake Writers Society, Vine Deloria Jr. And these 2 scholars are often known for helping establish the field of Native American studies as a legitimate academic discipline. During this period of sovereignty and self-determination, there were also a number of Indigenous activists exercising their sovereignty by advocating for treaty rights and better treatment of our people and communities during this time. Writers such as Ed Valandra, Nick Estes's book, Our History Was the Future. It was also during this time that the Oak Lake Writers Society emerged, and some of our writers began to publish their own books. On this list, we have Lydia Whirlwind Soldier's book of poetry, Memory Songs. And so each of these 10 books are intended to help guide teachers toward a better understanding of Oceti Sakowin literature and culture so that they can actually start to teach these texts in the classroom. This list of books includes a combination of fiction and nonfiction to help educate readers about our culture and our language and our literature and our history. In a lot of ways, these texts help ensure that contemporary and Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota students actually start to see themselves and their communities positively reflected in their school's literature and pedagogy, and that non-Native students start to learn how to appreciate and value our complex cultures, languages, histories, and literary tradition. So in addition to this timeline and this list of recommended reading, we also developed several other important educational resources. I had mentioned the bibliography of 200 books. We also developed discussion guides for each one of these books. And then most recently, we developed a new podcast series where we interview these writers or descendants of these writers so that to help aid teachers and students in their discussion and engagement with Oceti Sakowin literature. Before I turn it over to the panelists, I quickly wanted to say a little bit more about the Native Reads podcast. So as I had mentioned, we started this project just as the pandemic began, and that prevented us from promoting this project in any sort of way. We were actually approached by the Red Nation, and they wanted to partner with us and produce this new podcast series where we interview Oceti Sakowin writers and scholars about our recommended books. We recorded 12 episodes so far with Oceti Sakowin writers. And the series was actually so successful. More than 60,000 people streamed our podcast online. It was so popular that the Red Nation invited us back for a second season of Native Reads with Dene writers. This time we'll be interviewing Dene writers. But the podcast series, I think, was just a really unexpected development. We didn't plan on doing this podcast series. It was just something that came about after we weren't able to promote this project in the way that we had hoped. One other thing I just want to mention about this podcast series is I feel like I've learned more from these interviews than I learned from graduate school, from listening to these writers talk about their literature and how they're reimagining their culture and their language and their oral traditions. I really feel like I learned more listening to these than I did from my graduate studies. So before I ended, I did want to try to play a clip from the podcast series. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. I'm going to try.
The Battle of the Little Bighorn or the Greasy Grass fight.
Can you guys hear that?
Yep.
This is Joseph
The Battle
Marshall.
of the Little Bighorn or the Greasy Grass fight, as we call it. There are over 8,000 books, articles, scholarly papers, documentaries about that one event. But overwhelmingly, probably over 95% of those books, those documentaries, those articles were done by non-Native people. And while I appreciate some of them trying to be honest and honestly presenting our perspective, they simply can't do that because they're not Native. They're not Northern Cheyenne, they're not Lakota, Dakota, or Arapaho. They're not descended from any of the people who were there at that event. Some of us were, a lot of us were. And so we have a perspective that they will never, ever have. They might listen to somebody who was there, but they're there. But anybody who, it's all secondhand in that case. So somebody who is descended from somebody who was there, either just as somebody who was there in encampment or somebody who participated in the battle, we have a very unique perspective into that one event, and that transcends into everything about us. our culture, our language, our values, our norms, everything about us, our history. We have a perspective that no one else has. So that's the most important reason for us as Lakota people, as Native people, to tell our own stories, because we can tell it frankly, we can tell it truthfully, we can tell it from an insider's perspective that no one else has. So, so that's the battle of the Little Bighorn, or the greasy grass fight, as we call it. There are over 8,000 books, articles, scholarly papers,
Oh, I
documents.
think it started over. Okay. I really wanted to end with that podcast clip because I think it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of this presentation, right? For 200 years, our stories have been told by people from outside our communities. And really what we're trying to do with the Native Reads Project is we're trying to amplify the Oceti Sakowin voice. We're trying to draw attention to our rich and complex literary tradition. And so before I turn it over to the panelists, I do want to give you a list of where you can find all these resources. Because the Native Reads Project is really a grassroots project, our resources are kind of spread out across the internet. You can find the educational brochure, the discussion guides, and the list of children's literature on First Nations website at firstnations.org/Native Reads. For our bibliography of 200 books, you would look on the Oak Lake Writers Society website. And then for the podcast interviews, those are housed on our other partners' website, the Red Nation, at rednation.org. And so this is actually kind of our next steps for the Native Reads Project is we want to create an interactive multimedia website for teachers, students, and general readers where they can find all of these resources in one place. The way I honestly envision it is I envision it as, this story keeping timeline being interactive. You touch on, for example, the Lakota way, and suddenly you have information about the author. You have a discussion guide about how to engage with his books. We have recommendations for cultural-based activities. You have access to the podcast interview, all in one centralized location. And so that's what we're working on next. We want to expand and digitize the Native Reads Project. And that's actually, going to take a long time. Like I said, there's 200 books by Oceti Sakowin writers, so that's actually going to take a really long time, and it's going to be a continuous and ongoing project, but something I'm really excited about. So I've kind of droned on for a long time here. I do actually want to turn it over to the Native Reads Committee. They did a lot of heavy lifting for this project. They sat down and they read through and read and reviewed all of these books. And so I wanted to have a roundtable discussion with the Native Read Selection Committee just to get more insights into this process from them. And so I think what I would like to do is I'd like to begin by having each one of the writers introduce themselves, or each one of the Oak Lake writers introduce themselves. Who are you? How long have you been a part of this organization? And why did you agree to participate in the Native Reads Project? And I guess, Tashi, is it better if I call on each person individually, or do we just open it up and let each of the panelists share?
Whichever. I think Gabby and Laniko aren't muted, so you could start with them.
Okay. All right. Laniko, would you like to go first? You are one of the charter members of the Oak Lake Writers Society, so I'd like to begin with you.
Okay. I'm Laniko Lee, Minikanjo Lakota, enrolled citizen member of Cheyenne River. And I was invited to attend the first Oak Lake Writers Society retreat in 1993, and I've been a member ever since. So that makes like 28 years to count this year. Why did I join? Well, when I was in college, I learned about writing retreats and began looking for one that embraced Native American writers, or in my case, aspiring writers. But when I was not able to find one, I jumped on the chance to write with tribal members. of the Oceti Sakowin of the Oak Lake Writers Society. I have never regretted any minute that I have been a part of this society. And not only have I learned so much, but I have also grown in confidence with the kind of work that I do, which is not necessarily so much writing, which I have been doing, but helping other teachers and people who are doing what they can do to bridge the gap between the assimilation motive, or not motive, but the assimilation model that is our public education system and our tribal community literature and literacy.
Okay, thanks, Leniko. Gabrielle, would you like to introduce yourself? Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
I'm Gabrielle Tateushkanshka. I'm from the community of Enemy Swim on the Lake Travers Reservation. This is where two bands, the CC and Wachbekuwa, live. And I've been a long time member of the Oak Lake Writers. And to me, in my opinion, in my years teaching and being an artist and interacting with the community, I see that the education of tribal people wasn't always promoted, that my grandmothers went to the day schools that were located on the Siston-Wapton reservation, TPZ and TP Shaw. And at the time that they were educated, they were allowed, there was teaching of the language and people became literate in the language that they used. Riggs work on translating and making the language available, but there were problems that a lot of the students were women, and many of the words that were translated and the grammar used left out gender language of women. And so I grew up knowing that there were failures in the education system in terms of the Dakota perspective. And then after that period, the federal government didn't allow the missionaries to use the Dakota culture anymore in the school systems. And the missionaries were told that they wouldn't be funded if they continued these practices. I mean, I think that happened like at Santee Normal Training School. And I'm descendant of Charles Eastman. So when I grew up, we had Charles Eastman's books in our home. And so I read them, and then I heard stories about him, and I couldn't understand, well, here's somebody from our own community, he's Dawaka, Tula, and Wapton. And yet when I went to school, we didn't read any of his work, and nobody talked about it. And I found it confusing for me that I knew there was a tribal writer, and yet his work wasn't included in the curriculum. And then later on in my education, I went to school at the Institute of Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And then there's a huge library with books and books from all over the nation that included Native writers as well as non-Native writers, talking about many of the subjects, cultural subjects that are important to tribal people. And so in my own education, I can see the failing of the system when you don't educate people, to their own culture, history, and the stories that come from their traditions. And that the oral tradition is just as an important literary work as the works that are written today and printed. And then you begin to see that it's hard for Native writers to, get published and get their voices out there. And so that was one of the reasons the Oak Lake Writers were important to me. And also this project was important to me, that I want to see the next generation have access to writers and to think about the different subjects that these writers talk about and bring voice to. And I think it's really important because a lot of this work is invisible. And so if we want to create change in society, there has to be an understanding that, you know, the land theft and the genocide that happened to tribal people, it has to be acknowledged. But if people aren't taught, then they can't respond to create change because they don't know what the issues are. So that's briefly my interest in promoting these books.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Joe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sorry, just still trying to figure out the Zoom thing. My name is Joel Waters. I'm Oglala Lakota, also a poet writer, and I joined Oak Lake Writer Society about 19 years ago. And it was always pretty great experience to be with other Native-based writers, especially those within my own tribe, and to be able to share each other's work, to comment and help each other grow. That was really awesome. And then to be a part of this project here that we have done, I thought it was really important that there'd be also poetry that was included in there. And so I just wanted to make sure that you know, was something that would be showcased in there, that would be put in there, because I think that's very important within our society. And that's about it.
Thanks, Joe. And then Tashi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Tasha Agnopa Brando. I'm from Pine Ridge, Oglala Lakota, and I've been a member of the Oak Lake Writer Society for over 15 years. And I was really excited to be a part of Native Reads, in part because it gave me a chance to read some of the books, the authors of whom I've been able to hear talk about their work or are part of our society. And it was a chance to really comb through all of those. I also, when I was younger, did not know which books to read about our people. I knew that there is problematic information out there for us. So I probably went, you know, doubly the other way and didn't read maybe what could have been available, but I don't ever remember anyone really telling me, okay, this person's a tribal person who wrote something or is writing something. So this was a fantastic opportunity to take part in that. And yeah, so I'm really, really thankful to be part of the committee. And I think we have a really good groundwork. It was really interesting to me. We actually, I think you mentioned it, but the methodology that we put together for why we chose the books we chose. It's a really good ground level, whether you're a parent or a journalist, which were kind of the things I was thinking of, or a reader, or if you're a teacher, another writer, just, you know, somebody who loves books.
Thanks, Tashi. And then Mabel, could you introduce yourself as well?
Hi, I'm Mabel Peacock. I currently live in the Lake Traverse Reservation with the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, and I'm principal of the Teoshpazina Tribal School, the high school. I've been a member of the Oak Lake Writers Society for about 13 years or more, maybe 13 or 14 years now. And although I wasn't a part of the original Native Reads committee, I am helping to work with Native Reads now to help with the designing of the website and curriculum. So I'm joining a little later. I wasn't able to be a part of the community last summer, but yeah, I joined Oak Lake because I like to write and I like to read. I also didn't I wasn't led to any tribal authors in my schooling as in high school or college years. I was lucky though that my mom worked on the LSC Deloria project and posthumously republished some of LSC Deloria's books and worked with a lot of Zingala Shah writings and familiarized me with Charles Eastman. And so becoming an educator myself, that's one of the things that I wanted to do, was to bring more of this, these Dakota or Oceti Sakowin writers into the classrooms so that students can be exposed to those. And so that's what I've been working on ever since. And I'm really grateful to be a part of Oak Lake Writers Society. The members have really helped me with my writing and helped me with my thought processes of different Dakota issues or Oceti Sakowin issues. And they're just my mentors and my family that I go to when I need help with certain issues and stuff. And so we're really, really thankful for the society.
Thanks, Mabel. So I do want to have a roundtable discussion, and I don't know how to do this in a way where I'm not like calling on people. That feels like it hinders a discussion when I'm randomly calling on people. So I'm kind of just going to ask questions to the committee, and then I'll let you guys answer, you know, whatever question you see, you think, you know, you'd like to discuss. And so I think we've already talked about, you know, the fact that a lot of us didn't read any of these books in school. They aren't books that were recommended by, you know, teachers. Oftentimes, if we did read these books, they were recommended by family members or by friends. Can you guys speak to a little bit more about, well, I guess the question I'd like to start with by asking is, what did you guys learn from participating in this project that you didn't know before about Oceti Sakowin literature?
I think this is Gabrielle. I think one of the things that it helped me to realize was that intergenerational transmission of knowledge that happened in spite of the education system and the poor policies or the discouragement, you know, to become educated with a tribal perspective, especially during those assimilation years. I think when you see that there was some really strong resistance to not developing the culture. And so I think that's that whole timeline, that whole period really speaks to how important the culture and the literary tradition was for tribal people, even if it was small family groups that kept it alive, or you know, interested persons that had to do it outside of institutions, that it was kept alive. And I think the reemergence or the strength of that writing that happened during, you know, the activist period speaks to, you know, that long tradition of people being deep thinkers and thinking about, you know, how to move their community forward and create positive change. I think that was something that that vast knowledge and the difference of opinion too, that not all of the writers, you know, agree about how to create that change. Or I think even within my own family that Charles Eastman's older sister, Mary, was incarcerated at Fort Snelling. So she was a prisoner of war and then later incarcerated at Crow Creek. And she had a deep distrust of the American society because she had been a prisoner of war. And yet Charles Eastman was wanting people to become citizens because he thought, oh, then tribal people will have the protections of citizenship to stop injustices. And so even within my own family, there was a difference of opinion how to create that change. And you can see that with the writing of many of the writers, that people have different perspectives about how to bring that change about. And so that was something that was of interest to me, and something that I learned from reviewing these books.
I would agree with what you're saying, Gabby, when it comes to, I mean, it sounds a little bit ignorant probably, but sort of the idea that there's nothing really that new in any of our generations. We think about the 60s and 70s American Indian Renaissance, but to read, for example, well, Charles Eastman, who I was aware of, but who I hadn't been aware of was Luther Standing Bear until we read through his books. We read a lot more books than what the 10 is, obviously. And so, and reading all three of his books, it kind of showcased where his thinking and experience was at over his adult life was really interesting. Parts of it were really frustrating because, again, you had these people who were very much interested in using their education for the people, and then being told, yeah, that's nice, but no. And for example, he tried to go back and was teaching in Pine Ridge, and he wanted to teach both in Lakota and English, and really have kids like grapple with all those things. And he wasn't allowed. I believe it was a Episcopal church school, I think. And so anyway, it was like, well, there's nothing really new. And yet, I don't know, I found it really inspiring as well to see how quickly we were just using the tools given to us, or forced upon us, I should say. But what people had chose to do, I mean, it reminded me of what Elizabeth Cookland said about English. It wasn't her first language. She was just really interested in it, and she wanted to be darn good at it. And so anyway, I just saw this pattern of, yeah, these thinkers, these doers, teachers, people who are just really, really inspiring and thinking through these things. And so I guess like I said, I shouldn't have been surprised at all. But to see it in print, especially, like I said, Luther Standing Bear, I'd been aware of Ella Deloria and Water Lily and the brilliance of that, but it was just like example upon example to show it wasn't just one or two people. It was quite a few people throughout time. So.
And I like that you point that out, that it wasn't just one or two people. And I agree with both of you that the story keeping timeline really allowed us to see all of these different writers and how they impacted each other and how they engaged with each other. And so when I talk about Oceti Sakowin literature, I do always talk about it as a literary tradition, because that's very much what it is. Like you guys said, it's not just one or two authors talking about Dakota, Lakota, Nakota culture history, right? It's this entire spectrum of writers who are talking about the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition. And so I really do think that's one of the reasons why the story keeping timeline is my favorite tool that came from that educational booklet, because it really does show the changes and the transformation of that literary tradition. Joel or Laniko, do either of you have anything to say about the story keeping timeline?
Oh yeah, it was actually pretty good the way that you set that up. But I think the thing that surprised me working on this was how much, even though these are all different genres that we worked with, from scholarly to fiction to prose to like storytelling to just everything that was encompassed in there, each one of them has its relevance, and each one of them you can get inspiration from. And I thought that was really surprising to me, because some pieces were hard for me to read, that I had to like struggle to get through. But I mean, in the end, they all had their little nuggets of wisdom and importance to not only our history, but our culture and just their voice alone. So sorry to more on that than the timeline thing, but that's all I have to say on that.
And Leniko, I don't know if you remember, but when we did that meeting where we all came together to talk about the books, I remember you took all of the books that we'd read and you placed them on a table in different orders. Do you remember doing that? And that for me really became kind of the inspiration for the story keeping timeline, was when you laid all of these books out on the table and you explained to us how they fit, you know, with different historical or cultural moments. I think for me, that really became the inspiration for the story keeping timeline. Are you there, Leniko? Maybe not.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. What I found most intriguing about this entire project was how incredibly important it is for our future. Our young people, myself included, needed the fundamental experiences of reading about our own culture in a time when in my formative years as well as their formative years. What this genre does is keeps our culture, our language, and our history alive. It's part of the ingredients for self-identity and also for self-confidence. So many of our young people are led down the familiar path of assimilation. We have been pretty much grounded in what is Euro-American literature. So much so that we have, I can't help but think that most of the books that I read through my reading experience of K-12, even into college and graduate school, it was all about strengthening assimilation and a process of shedding who we are. And looking back over this project, I can't help but think that a lot of our values that we have run counter to what we've been experiencing in the classroom all those many years. So I have a real great appreciation for everything that has been my, what would you call it, baptism, so to speak, into the Oceti Sakowin authorship. My appreciation has grown immensely. And it's also made me aware of just how difficult it was for so many of these gifted and talented people to preserve what was so terribly important for those of us who had a sort of a big boulder in our educational experience with not having access to so much of the literature that we were privileged to read and digest on many levels. It also made me aware of the fact that a lot of their ideals, a lot of the ideals that we had been reading about for this project were kind of a driving force for all of these authors to get around so many challenges that they faced and to finally get published. I'm never, well, let's just put it this way. I'm taken aback every time I pick up that book, Witness by Josephine Wagner, how much dedication there was involved in there and how much they sacrificed. There were lots of setbacks and misplacement of important manuscripts and all. In just her life alone, you could just see how many trials she had to endure, challenges that were put in front of her to be able to not lose sight and finally have a work completed. It took not just her, but her entire family to engage in that process. And that just moved me. It moved me emotionally, psychologically, in so many ways. It's been like I said, it's been kind of like an immersion into something that some of us who were sent away early into mission school and then later on to federal boarding school and then back to mission school. And then it's just, that experience of being taken away from your culture, your people, your families. It's kind of like this entire Native Reads project has been a homecoming.
That's really beautiful, Lanico. I like the way that you describe that as a homecoming. And I think you make a really good point when you say that, everything that we learned in school was counter to our own cultural beliefs and values. And that kind of brings me to a question I have for you, Mabel. As an educator, how do you think contemporary Native students are going to benefit from a project like Native Reads? How are your students and teachers going to benefit from this project?
Well, that is a very good point, and I just like to start with that everything we learned was for assimilation. And even now today, that extends into the present, that education is a tool of the colonizer. And and to work in a tribal school and to really build on the perspective of the community is sometimes very hard. And just from my own perspective of being an English teacher for 10 years and then now a principal for 3 going on 4 years, I haven't been able to move forward in educating using these books or using this knowledge from our own community members in many cases, because I was confined to certain curriculums that were promoted by the schools that I worked for. So it's definitely extending into the present here, where we don't have Native teachers or Oceti Sakowin teachers in the classroom oftentimes in many of our schools. And so there is that lack of knowledge or that idea that teachers hold, where they are not from the community and they don't feel comfortable teaching, or if they do teach it, they do more harm to our students than if if they had more resources, so or training. And so I believe like the website and the timeline and all of this discussion questions and knowledge about the authors is really important for teachers, just to give, especially non-Native teachers, to give them a little more support towards teaching these in the classroom. Because I know, luckily, Tiosh Bazina, from my perspective right now, Tiosh Bazina has a multitude of Oceti Sakowin teachers in the classrooms. We have 8 or 10, including the 2 paras who are teaching content coursework right now and implementing some of these books and implementing Native Reads into their classrooms right now. And so, but that's luckily for Tiosh Bazina in the high school, and that might not be the case for other tribal schools on Oceti Sakowin reservations. And so, so Native Reads has really been a support, because if you, from my experience being an English teacher, I had to create my own curriculum oftentimes and push for it to be put into the classroom and validate why it is important, and even given curriculums where it was more of a pan-American Indian or pan-Native reading literature curriculum, then I had to say that there are Oceti Sakowin writers right here. There's Elizabeth Cookland, and oftentimes people didn't know them more often than not. So they didn't know the local writers. And luckily I was a part of the Oak Lake Writers Society, so I knew and interacted with a lot of great writers, and especially here in the system Wapton Oyate, there are many writers here that were and are still involved with Oak Lake Writers Society. And so luckily we have this community here, and it's really important for all just to, some of the things that I heard, education of tribal schools is not always promoted. And so I believe this is a way that can promote education from the community perspective.
Yeah, no, and I think you bring up a really good point, that this is a tribally specific, project, right? We deliberately chose not to do a pan-Indian project with a bunch of books about a bunch of tribes. We wanted to focus specifically on the Oceti Sakowin, one, because we're the Oak Lake Writers Society and that's what we do. But also I think it's important to recognize that every single tribe has their own unique culture, language, literary tradition, right? And it's important to read their books and their writers within that specific tribal context. Now, as part of this Native Reads project, one thing I didn't discuss in my presentation is that we actually established 5 standards that we use to evaluate these books. And I didn't include it in my presentation, but the 5 standards that we developed is what this 5 criteria we developed is that 1, these books should be authentic. The authors should be an enrolled member of an Oceti Sakowin tribe. Books couldn't be co-authored with non-Native individuals. These books should promote an intergenerational transfer of knowledge. They should promote Oceti Sakowin culture, language, history. These books should promote tribal sovereignty. That's one of the main goals of the Oak Lake Writers Society, is to protect and defend tribal sovereignty. These books should challenge stereotypes. As I mentioned, there are a number of books about Native Americans, but oftentimes these books perpetuate negative stereotypes about our people and our communities. So we wanted to ensure that the books that we included as part of this Native Reads campaign challenges these stereotypes. They didn't sensationalize or exploit our people any way. And then the 5th criteria was that these books are accessible and readable. Because we wanted folks to read along with us, we wanted to make sure that these books were still in print, but that was also somewhat challenging. It eliminated a lot of books for us to consider, because a lot of Oceti Sakowin books have fallen out of print or were never published at all. And so there are some books that we couldn't consider just because they weren't accessible and readable. And so we use these 5 standards to help us identify these 10 books. Does anybody on the selection committee want to say more about why they think it's important that these books, are authentic, promote intergenerational transfer of knowledge, promote sovereignty, challenge stereotypes, and are accessible and readable? Is there anything you might want to add about this criteria that we developed? Oh, I think you're speaking, Gabrielle. You're put on mute.
I think what is important about that transmission of intergenerational knowledge, that there's a misperception, I think, in American society that tribal people didn't have an education structure. And when you read like Charles Eastman's books or Luther Standing Bear and Joseph Marshall's work, and it's in Water Lily too, that, like the first teachers were the grandmothers and the mothers, and that there was a structure and there was knowledge that young people and children were expected to learn when they talk about the 4 doors of life, first is being a baby, and then childhood, and then adulthood, and then being an elder, that in that first stage of life, you know, when children often referred to as wakanja, that they were sacred, and as sacred beings, that there was a certain amount of knowledge that they were expected to learn even as children, and that's part of what that oral tradition is about, that there were values and history and knowledge of the culture, especially kinship as the stabilizing structure in a community, that young people are expected to learn. And so you can see the big harms that happen with that assimilationist attitude when children were separated from their community, and their community no longer have access to see, you know, how they were being treated or what they were learning, what harm that did when it disrupted that kinship system. And young people didn't get to know the elders in the community, and then you start seeing the breakup of society and the social structure when, and you see remnants of it today when elders are mistreated and children are mistreated, that kinship structure protected the rights of people in their communities, and now we have all kinds of injustices because that structure isn't in place. So I think all those authors that spoke to how they were educated by their grandparents and their parents, you know, to understand the language and culture, I think those are some things that we need in society today. And the other aspect is the one of Kushimaka or Unchimaka, depending on your dialect, that the rights of the earth, that you can see the earth is in peril today because there isn't an ethic and there isn't values about how to take care of the environment and protect the place that you live. And I think a lot of the sacred sites that were significant to the Oceti Sakowin aren't even in the hands of tribal people. They're in the hands of the federal government. You have, you know, the national park at Pipestone. I mean, you can go name Black Hills, you can go on and on. But a lot of these significant sites aren't even in the control of the Oceti Sakowin to be able to transmit and pass on the values and the structure that kept the society stable.
I'd like to piggyback on what Gabby was saying here regarding authenticity, regarding the whole concept of what it means to have an education. When we're reading books written by other people, other than our own people, about our culture and all, we're actually learning something from someone who is filtering their cultural history, heritage, and using our content in order for us to read what they have to say. So when we chose authenticity, we were pretty rigid about the way in which we interpreted that as a committee. And I think that was terribly important. You can see that in when we had a discussion about language and how some of the ways in which our certain concepts and ideas are expressed in Lakota language, they are as a result of missionary developed dictionaries and grammar books. Some of the nuances that we are made aware of are they're coming to us now, but we're having to make corrections as a result of the fact that our elders are pointing out to us that this is not how we say something, this the reason why we don't, and they explain it very clearly. So authenticity, I think, was terribly important for us to adhere to when we were deciding how we were going to make this selection. So in our own words, or in their own words, meaning the authors who did put forth, is not the same thing as told to or a ghost written work through whatever genre is there, because as so many of us know, having come to know other cultures, people who speak other languages, anything going into English from another source of communication, meaning another language, things are lost. And so much so that you have to recognize that a filter exists there. And in our particular case, that filter changed some of the values that were being promoted in books by individuals who were ghostwriters or people who wrote on behalf of those who were sharing information with them. So I just thought I'd point that out. I feel that the authenticity was one of the biggest challenges that we had discussion on as panel members, because some of the books that were not on the list, we had great respect for some of the elders that shared information. But unfortunately, having recognized that that filter, that Euro-Asia or Euro-American filter existed through even those examples, they were not a part of the 200. That by now it's a 200 plus.
Yeah, no, our bibliography has grown, I think, to more than 200 books. You know, one of the questions I wanted to ask the selection committee is, who was your favorite author and book on this list? I mean, we read quite a bit and narrowed it down to 10, but who was your favorite author on this list? And I'll go ahead and put up the list again too, so folks can see.
This is Gabrielle. I think one of the books that I think was really important was Elizabeth Cookland's Anti-Indianism in Modern America, that I think the injustices that still go on today in tribal communities have to do with the idea that that's the foundation of America, when they stole tribal lands and when genocide was a part of that theft, that legacy of hatred for tribal people still exists today. And then, you know, you can see in the news today, they talk about what's happening to George Floyd and others and that have happened. The same kinds of experiences happen in tribal communities that I think people don't know the statistics that, you know, police are more likely to kill Native people, you know, per capita in this country, but that doesn't get noted anywhere. And so, and I think that comes from the belief where Christianity saw America as wild and something to be conquered, whereas tribal people saw their native homelands as a relative, and that your relatives are not to be exploited. And that's part of the kinship system that set up that structure of how to live in place and, you know, with, you know, other living beings and entities, and how do people get along with each other. And we didn't have the concept of borders that, you know, the modern community has, or having deeds for land. That these were foreign concepts to tribal people, but it created injustices for them, these differing perspectives and land loss. And you know, what happened in 1862 to Lakota people, where they were exiled after, you know, that conflict, when, you know, their treaty rights weren't upheld, that there was a lot of injustices that, you know, nobody talks about, you know, what it meant to have, you know, 38 men, you know, executed for being soldiers for their sovereign nation. So you don't, you know, you're not having the dialogue that should happen to create that change of what's happening to, you know, our community people, and that they're feeling injustices. And it's not in the news or journalists aren't covering those issues compared to other societies and other cultural groups in this country. And that's the foundation of America, is exterminating Indians and theft of their land. And so Elizabeth Cook's, book and her many writings, she takes that to task, and it's not an easy subject to read, and it's can be uncomfortable, some of the issues that she brings up for non-tribal people who are unaware of this history and how they benefit from the theft and killing of tribal people in this country.
Likewise, I think, well, back to the question of things we learned as well. The book Not Without Our Consent by Edward Valandra, I think is a really important book because it's also within our grandparents' lifetime, for us 30 somethings. The termination era is the issue of both the federal and state governments trying to take what land base we have left through issues with ranching, with grazing, water rights. And it's really important that people understand the issues between the state of South Dakota and our tribes, and also understand how our tribes, the IRA governments that we now are the current political reality of the Oceti Sakowin Oyate, that these are actual political issues, government to government issues. They're based in treaties, but it's not just treaties. It's also federal courts, federal, and there's also a state memorandum, or referendum, excuse me, that was voted on, and how tribal leaders got together and worked. People think that, I think sometimes Standing Rock kind of happened just out of the blue, and none of these things are out of the blue. So I totally agree with what Gabby was saying about Elizabeth Cookland. We also almost included New Indians, Old Wars, and then we chose Anti-Indianism instead to represent her work. And New Indians, Old Wars, I was pleasantly surprised by how much hope she actually has for our people via American Indian Studies. However, that's really, I think, becoming an issue because we're seeing issues in academia where people don't want to talk about these actual gritty law cases, law battles, and issues with jurisdiction. People want more of a generalized pan-Indigenous kind of kumbaya thing, which is not our reality. And so all of these books together, I think, really speak to a reality that people don't want to think about. They think assimilation and the whitewashing of the American colonial project is reality, and it really isn't. It really skews people's minds. As far as, say journalism, trying to, for people to, I've had editors say, I don't want any of that Indian stuff, in the newsroom. Like, that's just something else, that's ridiculous. That's completely ridiculous. So that's a couple of the books. They're all really good, but
I think one of the things that, this is Laniko here, and I was just wanting to share that we do have a long and troubling relationship with the federal government and settler immigrants into our world, and do not recognize that in the public school system, let alone some of the tribal schools where non-natives are teaching classes. If we don't recognize those things, we provide a very troubling learning experience for the children who are being denied the whole story. Coming away from this business about accessibility and readability, there are a lot of books that we discussed before we made this selection, but there was a common theme that came across among the committee members, is that we needed to balance the shelves in these libraries. If we have tribal schools, then there should be books there read and accessible to our tribal children and the members of the tribe who are leading literacy activities in their community. So the authenticity and the accessibility and readability criteria that were the standard, I should say, that we were working with made Water Lily a wonderful way to enter into around the kitchen table discussions with our own families about some of the things that are so contrary to what we are taught without that kind of education. The other thing that came across was what happens when you have people who, writers, Oceti Sakowin writers, that embrace a common theme, a goal. One of my favorite books was Witness. And the reason why was because by reading Witness, I became acquainted with Susan Badlion, Susan Bordeaux Badlion, her book With My Own Eyes. The two women come together in such a wonderful collaboration to reveal layers of knowledge that were not anywhere available. The other thing that Witness provided was, when I was teaching, I should say, I asked a question in my classroom about how some of the children, how did you come by your name? And they had beautiful names that were, some of them were innocent as to how they became a family by the name of Red Tomahawk or White Eagle or whatever. And they had not really been guided in a way to reveal for them the connection they had to leaders in the community. They are descendants of very important people who helped shape the place and the where they currently are calling home as the reservation, are the tribal nations that they live on. So what I found most exciting about the book Witness was it as a massive learning tool. The aspiring writer is in there as she raises her children and has to eventually send them off to boarding school so that she can write. She had this goal in mind, and the sacrifices that she had made as a result of having this purposeful agenda for her life. And then she took the time to visit with Susan all of the various people that were at the veterans home in Hot Springs to learn what it was that she was able to share through those chiefs and headmen that are in the back of the book, towards the back of the book. So she really invested herself in a way that any aspiring young person could take a small section of that book every night and grow to a deeper understanding of what it means to want to share something for the future.
If I could say something real quick. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. I don't really have a favorite book on this. I don't think that actually that's really kind of fair to all the other ones that all the people that we read. But kind of going on what Laniko said about to something that kind of like was easily readable to to someone who probably is not used to reading these kind of books, the ones that, you know, were pretty easy for me to go through were Water Lily Memory Songs by Lydia, Whereas, and Our History is Our Future is the Future. Nick's book especially was very readable, very easy for me to get through, and it kind of reignited like the fires of my anger, kind of like not anger, but well, maybe a little bit angerness, but to just kind of get that history rehashed back to me, and of course learning new things from him too. And of course, Standing Rock was a big thing around that time too. So, you know, I think that really kind of pulled me into that setting. And with him and with Lydia, or sorry, with Laylee, we also got to remember to pay attention to the newer writers out there, because what they say is very important. And, you know, we just got to remember that too, because a lot of these other books we can read and have read in classes in college and whatnot. These other books, you know, they should not be ignored either.
Yeah, and no, I agree with you, Joel, about also acknowledging these newer writers, and those newer writers were under that category of the future. We didn't really give it a specific title, but it was writers who are publishing now and who are, you know, our contemporaries at this point. One of the things I do want to say that I appreciated about Our History is the Future, that I thought was really cool when I went back and reread the book, is that Nick Estes actually cited every single one of these writers on the Native Reads recommended reading list. And you know, his book was published even years before we had started this project. So I just thought it was interesting that he had already started citing every single one of these writers. And I think his book was one of the books we really sort of said was an example of a transfer of intergenerational knowledge, just because he was citing those authors who came before him, and he was incorporating, you know, their views and their voices into his book. And so I just wanted to mention that as well. And then also just to acknowledge Nick for launching that podcast series for us. The Native Reads podcast series is a part of the Red Nation, which Nick Estes founded. And it was actually Nick who came forward and said, well, if you can't promote this project in person, if you can't go out to schools, libraries, whatever, why don't we do this podcast series? And we start interviewing all of these different writers, or else, you know, if they're not alive, interview some of their family members. So I wanted to, you know, acknowledge Nick for that and thank him for launching that podcast series for us. One of the things that Leniko brought up is that, you know, we had this criteria of authenticity, and we discussed how some of, you know, we discussed how the books on this list shouldn't be co-written with a non-native writer. We wanted to focus specifically on Oceti Sakowin writers, but it did sort of raise a question for me, is what authors or books are missing from this list? You know, books that were perhaps co-edited or co-written.
I think that I'm just going to jump in. This is Leniko, and I was just going to say that I thought it was terribly important that we should have included Albert Whitehat's book. And part of the reason why was because of the language aspects of it all. But there again, we set that criteria up, and we decided that we needed to adhere to it, that there might be future opportunities for us to see how collaboration has embraced some of the ways in which publications can be more attainable for some of our own people who would not otherwise be in print. So I thought that Albert Whitehat's contribution should definitely have been in there. And a lot of people on the survey made comments regarding the Nyhart book, Black Elk Speaks, and we said the same there as well, because piecemealing through the book and learning more about what it was that was being imparted there, we found the filter, the American perspective, the settler perspective. So we did have some very important, not regrets, but hesitations on the part of the panel to be very straightforward and stringent with that criteria of authenticity. But I'm really grateful that we did, because it really gave us an opportunity for us to work ahead again and move in a direction of what it means to be published. Now, Joseph told us in his podcast how he went about getting published. But when we think about how inaccessible some of these publishing houses are for our people, on the strength of the past and how difficult it was to get published, we are now seeing in current present time some of our own people publishing. And I'm so grateful to have that happen while I'm still here, because it's up to us now to use that pathway to bring home some of the things that we need in our communities, some of the books that we need in our communities. And it might not be a money-making project on the part of our own tribal publishers, but on the other hand, the value is not in the money, but in the preservation of our culture, language, and history.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And it was really hard to narrow down this list of 10 books. But I mean, I think the good news is, right, that we want to expand and digitize native reads. And so we can go back and, add other writers. And I like to remind people that this native reads brochure is just a starting point. There were a lot of authors that we had wanted to include on this list, but obviously we had to narrow it down. And so, the good news is that with the interactive website, we can constantly add to this list and expand upon it. And so I think that's, a really positive thing. I do have one last question before we open it up to a Q&A session. Like I said, we hope that this Native Reads project becomes a model that other tribes can use in their communities. What advice would you guys as the selection committee have for other tribes who are interested in reclaiming their own literary traditions? After having gone through this process, what advice do you think you'd have for other tribes?
Well, as you indicated, Sarah, this is kind of like a template, and people can adapt what changes they need in order for them to begin something like this in their particular tribes. The compilation of books was an open-ended invitation for everybody who was a member of Oceti Sakowin Society to contribute titles, because there were books that titles that I heard that were out of print. These were books that came about as a result of someone in the family or someone who knew this person who wrote that book, held a copy or was aware of the copy. So the fact that we have this history behind us of people who had difficulty getting published, or their books were published once, they didn't make a flash pan, a lot of money for the publisher, so they kind of went in, became obsolete for their marketing values or whatever. And as a result of that, we had titles that aren't on our list. And we also found that those of us who were participating in anthologies for the Oak Lake writers, that some of our own books are out of print, and how to go about getting those printed so that they're more, the material or the content is available to the communities is a matter of promoting where the value lies in the community. So other tribes looking at this template, so to speak, will find more accessible ways of being able to pull together this very same value for their tribal heritage.
My only advice, I guess I would say, is kind of learn from our mistakes and maybe not do a survey like we did, or if you're going to do a survey, give it a little bit more time for more people to put in more input, because the survey, I think, was kind of excluded a lot of potential writers.
I really liked the survey and I thought it was beneficial, but I agree with you that we needed more time. I think the survey was open for like 1 month because we were trying to, roll out this project so quickly. So I think it would have been helpful if the survey had been open longer and we'd been able to have a bigger survey sample. But I also think it was a really good starting place. 200 books, it was really helpful to have, other people help us kind of start to narrow this down and identify some of those key texts. I think that was helpful in that it gave us a starting point. And I think, oh, go ahead, Tashi.
I was just going to make a comment. The bibliography, the 200 titles, we do know we're missing a couple books, I think, on there. But people are always, encouraged to submit other books. And something else to keep in mind, that not all of those books fit all the criteria that we chose for the native reads. So, the Albert White Hat book that Laniko talked about, that's on there. There's some other books that people have issues with for various reasons, and some other really just solid books that would fit all the criteria. So it's just important that people have it kind of an intentionality as they read it. The other thing is we chose books with archaic language to some degree, and just that's why we wrote the discussion guides, though, to get people through that. And then Sarah, when you're ready, we do have a question about the survey and maybe we want to go to the Q&A.
Yeah, no, we can go ahead and go to the Q&A. I think one last thing I just want to add about potential advice for other tribes interested in, reclaiming their literary traditions is that this project is something that's going to have to be adapted and modified by each tribe. As I had said earlier, every single tribe has their own unique culture, language, traditions, and values. So I think they're going to have to modify this project to fit the needs of their own communities. And they're really going to have to probably stop and determine what criteria is useful for them. But like I said, I think Native Reads is a good model for other tribes to start reclaiming their own literary traditions. And I think we see tribes that are interested in doing that. Like I said, recently we've partnered with the Red Nation to bring about a new podcast on just the Nay writers. So I do think we're at a point where we're starting to see more and more tribes trying to reclaim and revitalize their own literary traditions. So I think that's about all I will say about that. I'll go ahead and open it up to Q&A. Tashi, I think you said there was a question.
Yeah, so let's see. The first question was one, is there a copy of the survey available somewhere?
No, not yet. I wrote up the information for the survey, but it didn't fit inside of the Native Reads pamphlet. We only had 12 pages to work with, so we weren't able to fit the survey into the educational booklet. However, I do want to publish that survey material, and I don't know if that's probably a matter of me just writing an article for an academic journal about that, but I do think it's important to publish that resource.
And then somebody asked if we excluded books by our writers that weren't about Native content. And then to answer, and is our selection criteria posted somewhere? And that's in an earlier link. I'm not sure if people can see the link. I actually can give you the issue link, but Sarah, do you want to maybe talk to that, or speak to that?
Yeah, the selection criteria is inside the Native Reads booklet. I don't know if we can post a link to that online. We have the selection criteria listed there. And then what was the other part of that question?
So did we exclude books by our writers that weren't about Native content?
We only excluded, well, one of the things I should say is I don't feel like we excluded books, but we only focused on writers who are writing about Oceti Sakowin culture, language, or history. And so if there was a Dakota, Lakota, or Nakota writer who wasn't, who is writing about something other than our culture or literature, we didn't consider them for, for one of the top 10 books. So one of the criteria for this project was that whatever writer we selected had to be writing about Dakota, Lakota, Nakota culture, language, or history. And that sort of goes along with our criteria that these books should promote the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. So in some way, these books should contribute to our understanding of our culture, language, or history.
And our sovereignty.
And our sovereignty, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I don't remember really thinking about any that weren't about it. So that's an interesting question. But I do know we've had writers in our group that didn't write specifically about tribal issues, if that answers the question. We've had some like people who write medical things and some stuff like that. So, but that's a really good question. I'm gonna be thinking about that for a while.
Well, and also a lot of like more modern people that would like write, like say poetry, like Trevina Brings Plenty or Tiffany Midge, the criteria did exclude a lot of them because they were writing more about modern day, dealing with what they deal with, the racism in society, alcoholism, et cetera, stuff like that. That was excluded in a way, but because of the criteria.
I mean, Whereas still does though, but see, Whereas backed it up because she was going through the historical document while she was doing it. So yeah, it took precedence, I guess.
Yeah, the treaty, she wrote a lot about, or included a lot of the treaty, Fort Laramie Treaty in her work.
Any other questions? Oh, Elaine Silversmith just raised her hand.
Yeah, let me see if I can start my camera, if it's gonna work. Okay, so you can, sorry for that, Claire. Yate, everyone, thank you. It was just a very, very interesting and discussion because I went through the website. I'm Elaine, you see my name. I'm the librarian. I'm a librarian for NMAI and in DC. And I'm glad to say that we have all of these books in the library, but I'm also really curious about the children's list too, as well. Because throughout this conversation, there was mention of, the children also as well. So I wanted to give you a comment on that because I really like that list too. And American Indian Library Association has a children's literature award, and your criteria almost, is very similar to how American Indian libraries select the criteria to select for the American Indian Children's and Youth Literature Awards. I have a question. One of the comments is at NMAI, we and the National Museum of the American Indian in DC, we have more non-native staff than we do native staff at NMAI for a number of reasons. And I've been wanting to start a reading club. And so when I was really interested, when I first saw the Native Reads come out, because also with the Association for Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, the Institute is also working with ATOM on working on strategic plannings for tribal archives, libraries, and museums. So I wanted to start out with Deloria's book, Custer Died for Your Sins. Would there be, or I guess what I'm asking, would that be the book to start out the reading club with for the staff at NMAI? Deloria is also the namesake for our library.
That's a good question, Elaine. One of the things we did do with this Native Reads campaign is I have the wrong graphic up, but we organize the books chronologically. And so we sort of recommend that folks start chronologically, beginning with the oral tradition with, Joseph Marshall's The Lakota Way, and kind of following along with that story, keeping timeline. So that's kind of our recommendation for it. But one thing I do want to also point out is that recently Oak Lake launched a virtual book club as well. Tashi actually led that during COVID-19, and she focused on Nick Estes's Our History is the Future. And so we've been trying to do a virtual book club as well. We did it once for Native American Heritage Month, and hopefully we want it to be a more regular event. But yeah, I think our recommendation is to try and read the books chronologically, but I think they can actually be read in any order, and especially Custer Died for Your Sins, because he touches on every single one of these periods himself as well in his book. So that might actually be a good one to start with too.
Because he just has so many, good ideas, and NMAI's mission is really to teach about contemporary Native America. There's so much about, people come into the museum and they, want to see things historically, and but it's not, we are talking about DAPL, and the social injustices in Native America. So thank you so much. I want to just recognize all of you writers. I just got my copy of the Dene Readers, and I saw that's going to be the next one. But all of these books, everything is really helpful. Besides me being a librarian, I'm also on the board for Running Strong for American Indian Youth, which has a lot of programs in South Dakota. And 2 years ago, I was very fortunate to go on a tour, and we visited a number of the communities that Running Strong works with. And I'm sharing this with the organization as well, so that they can also get it out to the staff that's working out there in South Dakota, and then also to the other programs and participants. Thank you.
Thank you for helping us promote this. And yeah, you're right. Our next season of the podcast is going to be with Dene Writers, and it's actually based on the Dene Readers. We asked the editors of the Dene Reader if they wanted to participate in this project. And so for the very first episode, we're going to interview the editors of the Dene Readers. And then after that, we're going to interview 20 authors that are featured in the Dene Reader. And so hopefully that starts up, I think later this month or early next month.
Thank you so much for all of your work. Thank
you. Are there any other questions, Tashi, online or?
Not from the chat, so.
Okay. One thing I did want to go back to was Elaine's comment about the children's list, and I actually didn't get to that in my presentation, but we did also identify 5 books for younger readers about the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition, and you can find that on the First Nations website, that list on the First Nations website. But those 5 books include Virginia Driving Hawks Navies, Grandpa's an Indian and a Cowboy, Luther Standing Bear's book. Do you remember which book title? Someone can help me out.
Yeah, so I tried to just share my screen a little bit ago, but I don't think it worked. but just a second.
And then
Grandpa was a cowboy in Indian and Other Stories. Tashunka, a Lakota horse legend by Don Monolo. Greet the Dawn, The Lakota Way by S.D. Nelson. My Indian Boyhood by Luther Standing Bear. And Peta Shows Me Soon the Light by Jesse Taken Alive Rencounter. And I'll put that link below here. And I think it's important. So in our coffee visit last Saturday, I was sharing a little bit about the book, and I actually thought it was on here and it wasn't. Trickster and the Troll by Virginia Driving Hawk Sneevy. I'm not sure why we didn't choose that one, but there's another book that should be on the list. That book is, I believe, up there with the genius of, I'm really very interested in how fiction can carry not just culture, but thought and intellectualism in a way that, you know, essay and research papers and, you know, other journalism can't. I'm not sure that I will ever as a writer be able to replicate it, but I definitely appreciate reading it. And so I think The Trickster and the Troll is one of those that's really, really a fascinating read. It's also a very important read, I think, for allies, for people of American settler descent who, and especially if you know something of the immigrant nature of your own family. I think it's a really, really fascinating read. So I really think it's important. Virginia Driving Hawk Sneevy is a Dakota writer. And she wrote that book inspired by her own children. She married a Norwegian, and she wanted to pull the tales from both cultures for her Iyeska children. And so that book is really, really interesting. And it also has these little Easter eggs of Lakota, Dakota cultural knowledge, sort of like Elizabeth Cookland's work. And if you don't know it, you're not going to get it. But sometimes you know just enough to get it, and then you're like, oh, I knew that. So I think that's really fun too, or at least maybe it'll make you stop and think, go, and then go from there. So I think that's a really important book. And then Luther Standing Bear, we have My Indian Boyhood, which is it's a good book. However, he wrote 3, and I really feel like, it was just one of those things. It was too bad we couldn't shove them all into the first go around. But to read all 3 of his sequentially, I think would be a really interesting reading exercise for people, and it would make for a good book club as well, which we will probably have to do here. We're slowing down on some of our virtual events now that the weather's nice. I think we'll get back to it when the weather gets crummy again.
And I think, one of the reasons too, we ended up picking Grandpa Was an Indian and a Cowboy is because it's a collection of stories. So it wasn't just one book, it was a collection of a number of Virginia stories, because she's published so many books, but we could, again, for the purposes of this project, only identify one book. And so again, that's going to be the great thing about the website is
as a mom who's unschooling and homeschooling, I was able to hand The Trickster and the Troll over to my 9-year-old. He was able to get started with it. I don't know that, because there's a fantastical element to it. It's very engaging. So it's a fun. I don't know that fun is a goal, but I think it doesn't hurt. It's a fun read. And it really, it really made him ask some questions. We pulled out a map and found Norway, and, and I showed him, look how big Norway is compared to our land base. You really look at and compare these things. How much did our people, how much land did we call home? What was our geographical land look like compared to, some of these little places over in Europe? So I don't know. It was really engaging. And then we've been reading it together. So Julia mentioned it'd make an amazing picture book. And actually it was also made into an opera. My oldest son was actually in it. And I've been trying to find those resources as well, because it's a fun little book. So
Yeah, and then I think the other children's book I'd highlight was Petha Shows Me Sue the Light by Jessie Taking a Live Encounter. I think that's one of my favorite books on the list. So you should be able to find that on the children's list as well. But I do see that our time is about up. So I wanted to share my screen one last time, just to give folks some contact information if they want to reach out to any of us to learn more about the Native Reads Project. Like I said, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Our website, that's not our link. That's
Okay.
kind of our old one. It's oaklakeWritersSociety.com.
Oh, okay. So you can contact me at hernandez@unm.edu or Oak Lake Writers Society, our new website, oaklakewriterssociety.com, or you can email us and you can reach any one of the committee members through this email address of oaklaketribalwriters@gmail.com. So again, I just wanted to thank all of the panelists for being part of this project. And again, thank you to the Institute for American Indian Research for hosting this event tonight. We really appreciate the opportunity to share this. Like I said, we've kind of been sitting on this project for 2 years now. So it's really great to be able to actually promote it. So thank you.